Hello, welcome to Image Bearers. My name is Otoma Edje. We are now up to season 3, episode 25. I have the distinct pleasure and honor of having with us today Becky Castle Miller. Going to give a little bit of a read her bio right here, and then we'll jump in. Becky Castle Miller is a writer and speaker on emotional, mental, and spiritual health in the church. She recently graduated from Northern Seminary with a master's in New Testament context, starting with Dr. Scot McKnight. Her discipleship workbook with Dr. McKnight is called Following King Jesus, which we'll review a little bit today. She is working on a new book about Jesus's emotions, which is going to be flat awesome. It's going to come out in a year or so. Both her and her husband have 5 kids and 2 cats, and they just relocated to the United States after living in the Netherlands for the past 8 years, working at an international church. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I'm sure it must have been a culture shock coming back to the US, even though you are American.
Yes, we had lived overseas for so long that we really started to integrate into the Dutch culture. My 2 youngest kids were actually born at home in the Netherlands. So they've grown up bilingual in a multicultural church. So moving to the States was foreign for them. And it feels foreign for me too. I keep running into reverse culture shock, just going to an American grocery store. They're so much bigger. Yeah, I try to take my bike for a ride. In the Netherlands, you've got dedicated bike paths. Here, you try to bike on the street and the drivers honk and yell at you because they don't want you on the street. So you go on the sidewalk and then the pedestrians yell at you. So biking is a struggle. And then just cultural things I hadn't realized I picked up so much. The Dutch are very direct. They just tell you what they're thinking with no niceness. Mm-hmm. They don't mean to be mean, but it comes across so differently than the American kind of fake niceness that we've sort of adopted in America. So I got used to speaking in a very direct manner, and that keeps getting me in trouble here in the States because people think I'm being rude. So yeah, it's a big change for all of us.
No, I hear you. I was in Africa for a number of years as a missionary, and I think one day I said no brainer, and someone was like, whoa, I haven't heard that term in a long time. There's just so many little nuances. So I guess one thing real quick before we dive in, what has it been like? Because I know we just recently had Earth Day, and I'm not sure how things are. I'm thinking in the Netherlands, they're probably a lot more environmentally conscious. I don't know if that's true, but how does that compare to what you see in the United States?
Yes, that is true. The kids would come home from school and remind me to be recycling when we were in the Netherlands. They take recycling very seriously. They're all around town, little recycling centers, and you take your recycling every week. I would put mine in my cargo bike. So I had like a bike with a basket on the front, and I could fit 4 kids or like 4 bins of recycling in it. And I would cycle over and the kids would help me sort our recycling. It's free to recycle. And everyone bikes and walks everywhere. There's much less car traffic. People take trains and buses, great public transport. People really value nature. You don't see litter. You don't see graffiti. People just really take care of their city and their countryside. They spend a lot of time in nature. And the cultural difference, besides just the difference in focus, is that I've noticed that some American Christians oppose stewardship of the earth, which seems so strange to me. Like, God made us stewards of the earth. That should be a Christian value. But for some reason, it seems to have gotten tied with liberal politics in the US. And so conservative Christians oppose measures like anti-climate change measures, which I would think Christians would support. So Christians in Europe don't have that distinction. They're very pro-science, pro-environmentalism. So that's an interesting cultural divide.
Wow. Well, I'm so excited again that you're on the program. The thing I wanted to discuss with you today is the instructor manual that you put together for the Blue Parakeet. And I know you have, both versions of the book with you. If you could, so the one on the left, at least from my viewpoint, the blue one is the second edition.
Yes, this is the first edition. This is the new one, and it's a lot thicker.
Yeah.
So you can see that Dr. McKnight added a lot of new material in this new edition.
Okay, awesome. So I know also you and I we're Twitter. We follow each other, I think, on Twitter, and I think you had recently mentioned that this book has really impacted you in a very significant way. If you could maybe share about number one, the impact of the book, and then also what led you to decide to write the instructor manual, and I guess kind of throwing it all together, what your role is as the discipleship director. What does that mean specifically?
Sure. So when I first moved to the Netherlands 8 years ago, I had a passion for missions and ministry. I had always felt a calling to do that. But I grew up in very conservative Christian circles where women couldn't be pastors. So I didn't see any women as role models for my ministry calling. I only saw women being missionaries or children's directors, etc. So once we moved and got settled in, and I started launching our small group ministry. I launched a pastoral care ministry. And I started to have this desire to preach and teach and to pastor people. Like my desire to shape that ministry calling toward pastoring people was growing, but that didn't match the theology I had grown up with. So I started reading and researching a lot. And the first book by Scot McKnight that I came across was The Blue Parakeet. Now it's about reading the Bible. But one of the test cases he gives in the back for how do we read the Bible today? How do we understand the Bible in its context and then apply it and live it out in our context? And one of the models he gives is, let's look at the issue of women in ministry. Now, Scott would call himself a mutualist. A lot of other people would probably use the term egalitarian to describe him, meaning that Scott thinks that all of the gifts of the Spirit are for women as well as for men, and that the church needs women's gifts, and that God wants women to be free to use their gifts in the church, that mutuality. And so as I was reading books about this and discerning scripture on it, I came to the same conviction that Dr. McKnight holds, which is that women are free to pastor and to teach and to lead in the church. So Scott's work was really instrumental in helping me see how we read the Bible faithfully and set women free to serve God in however God calls them. As I started to follow more of Scott's work online, I started reading his blog and commenting and developed a relationship with him. I heard about what Northern Seminary was doing with their Master's in New Testament and offering it online. Well, I had started to feel called toward being a pastor. I knew
this is while you're still in the Netherlands, right?
That was while I was still in the Netherlands. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this was about 2015.
Okay.
Yeah. So Northern was launching Northern Live online master's degrees. And that was perfect because I was praying about going to seminary, but I didn't want to leave my church. I didn't want to leave my context. My Dutch is okay, but my Dutch wasn't good enough to study at a Dutch university to go to a local seminary. So I contacted Dr. McKnight and asked about this program and ended up applying. And so I was in their first cohort for this new degree program. We were kind of the guinea pigs. So my classes were on Zoom before Zoom classes were cool. In 2016, I started, and my
They're past cool now. We're tired of Zoom, man.
it was novel and innovative when we
Sure.
So I was in the Netherlands, and Northern is in the Chicago area. So my classes were from 11 p.m. to 1:40 a.m. in my time zone.
Wow.
And I did that for 4 years while pastoring and having 5 kids, and my husband was traveling a lot for work. It was a really tough season. But I developed that relationship with Scott, got my degree. And while I was studying there, Scott reached out to me and said, my new edition of Blue Parakeet is coming out. You're a good writer. Would you help by writing the instruction manual for that for Zondervan? That then led to my doing an instructor's manual for his book, Teaching Romans, or his book, Reading Romans Backwards. My instructor's guide is called Teaching Romans Backwards.
Yep.
And then that also led to our collaboration of Following King Jesus, which was a discipleship book that we wrote together. Mm-hmm. So Blue Parakeet set me on this path that led me to meeting this mentor and friend, to studying with him, to opening doors to publishing, and kind of to move back to the US. We're here to support family, but we actually moved to the Chicago area. And I continue that relationship with Dr. McKnight, and we've got some more collaborations in the works.
Oh, that's awesome. I am so looking forward to the book that you're going to have coming up at some point is in reference to Jesus and his emotions. I think that is so important. All right.
My master's thesis at Northern. I wrote my thesis on Jesus's emotions.
Okay. That's awesome. So according to Dr. McKnight, What is the blue parakeet, as we dive into that book a little bit, just as far as understanding it, and why is it an important metaphor to consider when reading the Bible?
So Scott and his wife, Kristen, are bird watchers, and they're really serious bird watchers. They go out every day for walks and they can identify birds. When I went to Italy with them on a class trip, we went to Turkey, Greece, and Italy, like a Footsteps of Paul tour. Everywhere we went, they were noticing the birds and telling us about what kind of, they could hear a bird's song and tell us what kind of bird it was. So he tells the story in the Blue Parakeet about seeing this blue bird in his yard that was very out of place and startling, and it was throwing off all the other birds. They didn't know what to make of this blue bird. It was an escaped blue parakeet that was out of its natural habitat. It should have been. So
it had been caged. Just to it had been caged.
It got out, and it was sort of creating chaos in his yard with all of these wild birds. Didn't know what to do with this domesticated bird. So they watched it for several days and watched how it was surprising and out of place, and made them pay attention. So Scott uses that as an extended metaphor throughout the book about those surprising passages we see in the Bible that we don't really know what to do with, that seem out of place in our culture. Things like foot washing is one example he gives. It's a clear command from Jesus in John that we should wash each other's feet, but we don't do that today. So what does that mean? That's a blue parakeet. It's surprising, it's shocking, we don't know what to do with it. And it causes us to pause and pay attention and ask what's going on here. So that's a fun metaphor that runs throughout the book. He concludes it by saying, let's let the blue parakeets go free. And he uses that in his talking about women, like let the women out of their cages, let them sing, let them free.
Mm-hmm. And I think also what I got out of that was to not try to, and I think you may have mentioned this, try to tame the Bible and make it fit into the mold that we think it should fit into. The things that don't make sense to us, let's keep trying to figure them out, because there's a reason why they're there. I think one of the example was Junia, where Junia was because it didn't make sense. They tamed it and made it Junius into a man's name, which was totally not correct.
Yes, Junia is a good example.
Yeah.
Okay. Is she outstanding among the apostles? Is she one of the apostles? And actually doing that work, reading the Blue Parakeet is one reason that I named my youngest daughter Junia.
Really?
My little 5-year-old has just run into my office. We actually spell it with a Latin spelling, Unia, with an I, because we had a kid with a J initial, but she's our little baby apostle.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's got high hopes for her.
Yes. So
in the second chapter of the Blue Parakeet, Scott mentions that there are 3 ways that we can read the Bible. Can you briefly explain each one of them?
Mm-hmm. So the first one is reading to retrieve. We go into the Bible to try to pull something out and just bring it straight into our culture today. And sometimes we try to seek to retrieve all of it. So and I'm referencing the book to make sure I get all the quotes right. If Paul says women should be silent, then women should be silent, and taking it literally. This is maybe another way of saying reading to retrieve is reading everything literally. Mm-hmm. If Exodus says the death penalty is appropriate, then it should be appropriate for us in all circumstances today. So it's going in and just plucking it straight out and trying to plunk it right down in our culture. But he suggests an alternate to that, which is to say those days and those ways. So Moses served God in Moses's days in the ways that were appropriate to those times. And God spoke to David in David's ways, and God spoke to Paul in Paul's ways, and God speaks to us in our day and in our way. So we need to discern how God's carrying on God's redemptive pattern into our world today, knowing that God has spoken in different ways to different people throughout history. Mm-hmm. The second is reading through tradition, which means that we sometimes fossilize our tradition. We say, well, the church has always done it this way. And yes, there have been disagreements, but this is orthodox. This is the way we have to do it. It's always been done this way, and we can't change. So based on the teachings
of the church, not necessarily scriptural, but over the years, the church, whether it's the Catholic Church or our church or whatever church it may be, have done things a certain way, and we're going to go with what they say without really questioning it.
So it's like before we open the Bible, we put the tradition glasses on, right, and we're looking at the Bible through tradition. Then we're not necessarily interpreting it in the most correct way because we can't see through that lens of tradition. We're too tied to tradition sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that tradition is bad. Tradition is good. We trust the tradition handed down to us through church history, yet we recognize there are times when it's been wrong and it needs to change. Mm-hmm. We understand better, we understand more. So the third way is reading with tradition, which is different from reading through tradition. And reading with tradition acknowledges the value of tradition, and yet says there are times we need to conserve and there are times we need to innovate. Mm-hmm. There are some parts of the tradition that we do want to hold to, we want to be faithful to. We want to continue those practices of the historical church, but there are other ways we need to innovate and be different because we see that God is moving in different ways or we understand something better. One example of that would be when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And we have so much more knowledge about Second Temple Judaism now than we had before. And it truly changes the way that we can read, especially the New Testament, because we understand Judaism differently. So we understand Jesus's world differently. We understand Paul's world differently, and that changes our interpretations. Scott is a New Perspective on Paul scholar. So obviously I've learned that from him, and I know there are variations on that view. But I think New Perspective coming out of the Dead Sea Scroll discovery is a good example of reading with tradition. So those are some of the ways we can read the Bible. And that balance between conservation and innovation, to me, feels like a really healthy way to read the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think with that, the only thing that I would probably state also is that it is important for us to not just pick up the Bible and read it, but to also understand the tradition that has come before us, not again to be fossilized as you stated, but it's also very dangerous to just pick it up and read it. And I think, was it Luther or so, had like a catechism that he wanted people to go through to understand. Not saying that it has to be to that level, but I do think there is value in tradition, is guess what I'm saying.
Yes, there is value in tradition, and we don't want to throw all of that out. That's interesting. I totally agree with you that it can be dangerous to just pick up the Bible and read it with no training. But I found some Christians very resistant to my saying that. Some people are very committed to the idea that every Christian should be able to read the Bible on their own and completely understand it with no training. And I'm going, well, I mean, I have a seminary degree and I still don't know enough. So I'm looking at a PhD now. And after I finish that, I still won't know enough. So yeah, I am totally with you on that. We do need training to understand the Bible well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So in chapters 3 and 4 of the Blue Parakeet, Scott covers some of the incorrect ways we can view the Bible. Can you please share about those different ways and also how we should view the Bible?
Mm-hmm. So one of the examples, or one of he calls them shortcuts. So shortcuts to reading the Bible would be to look at it as morsels of law. We go in and we try to find rules that we can follow. And he talks about how his church that he grew up in was very much a morsels of law approach to the Bible. And all kinds of commandments got created, including thou shalt not go to movies, thou shalt not drink, and thou shalt not play cards. And I know that persists today. My husband has a good friend, and when they were in college, he used to go to his friend to hang out, and the friend was living with his grandmother at the time, and the grandmother would not permit them to play cards in the house. They wanted to play cribbage, and she said cards were of the devil, and that was not allowed in her house. So they would go down the street to Dunkin' Donuts and play cribbage there. So I know that persists, all these rules and these morsels of law that we add to the Bible.
Sure.
A second one is morsels of blessing and promises. I think anyone who's ever seen an inspirational Bible calendar will understand that. It's taking a verse out of context and believing that the promise in the verse must be for me today. Instead of
Jeremiah 29:11, maybe.
Jeremiah 29:11 is a great example of that. New Testament scholar Craig Keener just posted a picture on Facebook the other day of a mug that his friend gave him, and it said, "I can do all things" through a verse taken out of context. which is a play on I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So looking for these promises that weren't necessarily written for us. They were written for a particular people at a particular time. Now there's timeless principles we can draw from those about God's character, but maybe that's not a promise for us every day.
Right.
He talks about mirrors and ink blots as well. And that's kind of trying to make Jesus like ourselves. We look in the mirror, we see what we're like, and we imagine Jesus kind of in our own image instead of realizing we're made in the image of God. God isn't made in the image of us. Or a Rorschach blot. So it's amorphous and you kind of see what's going on in your mind. Maybe tarot cards are a good example of that. You see in it what's already in your mind and it sort of draws that out of you. So it's kind of a magical way of approaching the Bible, as opposed to really understanding it in its context correctly. Another would be shortcut 4, puzzling together pieces to map God's mind, which is, I want to be careful not to slag on systematic theologians. I'm a biblical scholar, not a theologian, but I'm not like anti-theologians. But some people get too tied to their systematic theology, where they take bits and pieces from the Bible and try to put it in a coherent system and then get really tied to that system. The Bible wasn't written to be a system. It was written as God's story with God's people over history. So sometimes we go too far with our systematic theology and try to make it all fit neatly, which it doesn't really do. Shortcut 5 is maestros. And he talks about choosing one character in the Bible and then kind of reading the rest through that lens. So you can have Jesus as your maestro and read the whole Bible through the lens of Jesus. I don't think that's far off from a really good way to read the Bible. But you can also take Paul as your maestro. And I've noticed that certainly in like Reformed circles in the US, it seems that they preach a lot from Paul. And I don't hear as much gospel preaching. Sometimes we get too much focus on a particular Bible author and we look at the rest through their lens. And the problem isn't Paul, the problem isn't Jesus. The problem is losing sight of the big picture by focusing too intently. So those are some of the shortcuts we can take. And the better way that Scott proposes is reading the Bible as a story with power.
And I think adding to that, I think it was also stated that each of the 66 stories are basically like wiki stories. So they all make up the one main story. And, there's just a lot of really good stuff in. I think it talks about icons and, how they were broken, and that covers part of the Bible and the New Testament, in the Old Testament, and then becoming a community. I just love the way it's laid out. I think it was very, very helpful to see that story just, over time and applying to each person in history, and for us to look at it the same way. And how do we fit into that story? So
yeah, I told a university minister in Kansas City recently that I could tell the story of the whole Bible in 20 minutes. And he challenged me to do it. So I did a session on Zoom with his students back in January. And I did it in 24 minutes. It wasn't quite under 20, but did the whole story of the whole Bible using Scott's model and filling it in. And his model is that the story of the Bible is theocracy, monarchy, Christocracy. And then I just filled in some of the major characters and moments through that. But it's God reigning directly, the theocracy. Then it's the people wanting a king. And so God reigning through the king. And then Jesus coming as king and God reigning directly again as king. And so Christocracy is theocracy. So that's the main overview of the next 4 chapters of Blue Parakeet. He goes into the detail of that story.
And those, he would consider them chapters in the story, I think is what he had stated. And then there's also a beginning, middle, and end. Did you want to share a little bit about that real quick?
The beginning is God creating the heavens and the earth. The middle is humans kind of mess it up. That's maybe the best summary. And then the end is God creates the new heavens and the new earth. And there's a whole lot of messing up that goes on in the middle, but that's the main plot, that we're looking forward to the new creation, which will be a healing and a restoration of the original creation.
No, I think it's a very helpful, and that's why I wanted to have you on, because I think as you obviously digested the book very powerfully, and then obviously wrote the instructor manual, I think it's a very helpful way for people to understand the Bible, I believe, correctly, you know. So let's go ahead and dive into the actual instructor manual that you put together. So if you could maybe just share your screen and just show kind of how you put it together, how it's laid out, and also how people can find it.
Yes.
Help
so
with training.
the way, yeah, it's a free download. The way to find it is to go to the Zondervan academic website, and you'll need to create an account. And it asks for your church or your institution, because it wants Bible teachers and school teachers to access it. I think it's fine to use, if you're a lay person and you're wanting to train people, use the name of your church or institution that you're using it in, and you should be able to create an account. So let me share this. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the Zondervan academic website, and they have these textbook plus materials. You can see, I don't know, can you see my cursor moving on the screen?
Yep.
Right. So you can see these textbook plus signal. They also have one for how to read the Bible for all it's worth, and I used that kind of as a model. That's a really useful resource. So you just click on that textbook plus logo, and then you'll be able to go to the materials.
Mm-hmm.
There are textbook plus instructor resources and textbook plus student resources. So let's look at the instructor resources first. There is an instructor manual, which is a Word document that you can download. And this has chapter summaries where I give a one-page overview of the entire chapter for each chapter in the book.
Okay.
The student objectives to help teachers plan their sessions. Then I offer suggestions for essay questions, for tests and quizzes. I give you full exams if you want to do it as a 4-credit course or have them take the exams, and then syllabi for planning it out over a certain number of weeks. And I give several different examples for dividing up the material depending on how long you want your course to be. Now, I have taught this myself while I was in the Netherlands in my role as discipleship director. I taught a group of university students who were not Bible majors or theology majors. They were studying international health and political science and lots of other things, but they wanted to learn the Bible on a deeper level. So I used my own instructor's manual to teach the students, and it worked well. So I can say that as a teacher, this worked really well to teach engaged students, and we had a lot of fun. So I go through key terms that the students will want to learn, which will help them as they're reading the chapter. I would suggest giving them the key points and the key terms before they read so that they pick up better on the outline of the book as they're reading through it.
Okay.
So then I do a bullet point, key points of the whole thing, a chapter summary of the whole thing, try to bring out a little more about the main points.
Mm-hmm.
Then I also included websites for more resources on the topics covered in that chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are resources from Scott, and some of them are other like things from the Bible Project. And then I gave suggestions for what to do in your class. And I tried to get creative with these. I love to be a creative teacher. I'm very into costumes and acting and props and games, because I think when students are laughing, they're learning. So I hope that you'll enjoy these. And I've done some of these activities with students. So I can
What are some examples of the fun activities that you have?
So there is a quiz in the book, actually. The discernment quiz is fun for them to go through, how they read difficult instructions in the Bible. There's discussion questions, and then we did like a debate. This was one of the discussions, how to have a debate about issues that we disagree on for interpretation. What were some of the other ones? We did, there's a tongue twister that I pulled out of the book to see who could do the tongue twister faster. We performed Philemon because it's so short and it's a script.
Sure.
And we actually did this in front of the church as a sermon. I gave cultural context on Philemon, and then I had students dress up in costume and act it out in front of the church. And basically I made the whole church congregation be like the people sitting in Philemon's house and listening to hear what was going to happen to Onesimus. And they loved it. That was a really memorable activity for the whole church because it made them feel like they were in the Bible, and it helped them relate to it in a new way. So we did a lot of reading scripture out loud. We looked at funny videos. There's a chapter in the book that talks about an analogy of a water slide for how we read the Bible. And so I had them watch funny YouTube videos of actually going down water slides to cement that analogy. So we did a lot of fun things in that class. Awesome. So this is kind of the key part of the whole instructor's manual piece, is this actual instructor's manual. But I also created slides. So if you want to teach in a more traditional classroom format, you can use these slides that will give you the main points of each lecture. It's a beautiful template that Zondervan designed for us to use.
Those are nice.
So I just pulled out the main points. And if you're following along with the instructor's manual, these key points summarize and reflect what's there. So you'd be able to teach, once you've read the chapter, you can just have the instructor's manual as your notes and these slides, and you should be able to teach a lecture on that content.
It's awesome, very helpful.
Let's see, then there's also for the students, there's a study guide. So if you do want to give them the exams, there's a study guide they can use to refresh their memory on the books. I wish that I had had study guides like this for my seminary courses. My early church history teacher gave the hardest exams I have ever taken, and we had to create our own study guides, and I spent hours and hours studying for that test. So this, if they have gone through this, they will not only have mastered the material, but they should ace the tests. And these study guides reflect the actual exams that are in the instructor's manual. And then Zondervan created these really cool student flashcards. And you can go through these, and it's an interactive online flashcard. So you want to match the terms with their definition. So let's see if I can do these real quick. Choose. Oop, oh, nope, that's adopt and adapt. I did this myself the other day to make sure that it was working, and
that's cool.
So that gives you an idea of what the flashcards are like. So that will help the students memorize the content. So that's basically an overview of it. It's everything you would need to teach the Blue Parakeet as a course.
So I think, as you said, this kind of started out, I think Scot McKnight realized you're a great writer, and so he recommended that you put together for Zondervan the instructor manual for the Blue Parakeet. And I think that led, I don't know what came first. Was it the teaching Romans backwards or following King Jesus?
I think that I wrote Following King Jesus and Teaching Romans Backwards in the same year. That year is such a blur. That was such a busy year.
Were you also studying at the time?
Yes, I was in seminary and had 5 kids.
You're a glutton.
And I was working.
And you were still were you still recycling?
I was recycling every week. Serving at my church. That year was, and I was also speaking at our church hosted a European Bible conference. And so like while I was finishing Romans Backwards, I was also coming up to the deadline for helping host and speak at this conference. I didn't sleep. I remember finishing the Romans study guide at 3 a.m. at my husband's standing desk. Like I have to stand, like if I sit down, I will fall asleep. I'm just gonna type and get that turned in. Then the next morning I got up and went and spoke at this conference. I don't recommend that. I've learned a healthier pace of life now. Yeah.
Well, Jesus had emotions, so
there were a lot of people. I definitely crying that weekend.
That's awesome. So somewhere in there, it all blended together between teaching Romans backwards and then following King Jesus. I do want to switch gears a little bit and talk about that one. If you can share about the various books that make up Following King Jesus, and also really what it's about.
Sure. So this is a discipleship workbook that I put together using Scot's material. And I have to say, Scot practices what he preaches about empowering women. A lot of publishers would have put his name on this and not mine, even though I did all the work, because he's the big name author. And he actually fought the publisher really hard and advocated for me. And it's not even Scot McKnight with Becky Castle Miller. It's Scot McKnight and Becky Castle Miller, which in publishing is a big deal. It means he acknowledged me as on the cover as a co-author, but in his blog posts and on his podcast, he says, this isn't my book, this is Becky's book. She did the work. I took excerpts from his previous books. So the King Jesus Gospel, the Blue Parakeet, One Life, and Fellowship of Difference. I took excerpts from his book and then created a 24-week discipleship curriculum based on that. So I just
mentioned you used a C pen at some point. I'll have to learn about
I did. Let me grab that.
Okay. Getting all the secrets today, everyone. Getting all the secrets.
Oh, I can't find it. It's in my shelf and I can't find it. So a C pen, it kind of looks like this, but it's a little bit wider and it's a tiny scanner. And so you run it over the text and it scans it in and it OCRs it. So what you get in your Word document is the actual text. So I had to go through Scott's books like One Life, choose the excerpts that I wanted to include, and then scan them in line by line. If I had to type all that, it would have taken you forever. So I used the C pen scanner and just went line by line, and it put it into my Word document as editable text. I had to clean it up a little bit, but then I was able to format it and use it. So you can see each lesson includes, like the gray box is an excerpt from Scott's work. This is my husband's copy. I hope he doesn't mind my showing his handwriting. So there's from Scott's work, and then there's discussion questions, personal study questions that you can go through. And then there's a Bible study that I created for each section. And it's additional scripture verses to read that expand on the concept that he was talking about. And then there's typical Bible study questions. What does Zechariah think God is doing through Jesus in this passage in Luke 1? And then there's a chance for you to do a prayer exercise. And I tried to make each one of these 24 prayer exercises different. Like this one is write a poetic prayer in the style of Psalm 72 or Mary's song or Zechariah's song. So there's sometimes you write a prayer, sometimes you say a prayer, sometimes you do a liturgical style prayer, sometimes you take a walk in nature and pray. So different ways of engaging God in prayer. There's an action for you to take personally, and then a journal question that you can reflect on. So that's all what you can do personally if you're doing the book by yourself. Then if you're doing it in a small group, there's also a group discussion guide. It's mirroring, isn't it? So that's probably backwards, but.
No, I agree, it's good, yeah.
So there's a group discussion guide, and you discuss the reading, the Bible study, and then you pray together. And then there's a group action or activity that you can take together. And I've done this with a small group in the Netherlands. It was the last small group that I led before we moved. And we did the first section of the book together. And it went into the pandemic. So we went from meeting in person in my home for dinner to meeting on Zoom when we had to go into lockdown in the Netherlands.
Yay, Zoom.
Yay. But, it worked. And so again, I not only created this, but I've actually led a group through it. So I know that it works well for group content. And I also, in supervising our small groups ministry, I was training our other small group leaders to lead their groups through this material as well. And I've actually, since I've been back in the US, I've met with some groups of church leaders across the country who are planning to use Following King Jesus. And I've done like a Zoom training for their leadership team on using this material. So I am available to do that. If anyone is interested, I'd be happy. Just contact me. I'm sure you can put my email address in the show notes or something, and then people can contact me, and I'd be happy to talk to them about using Following King Jesus with their church.
Only between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m.?
While I was still in the Netherlands, I did a training several times for church leaders in Florida, and it started at 3 a.m. So that I'm really glad to be back in the US as far as these time zones. This is much better now. So now I can train you on a normal time and not in the middle of the night. My favorite part
as you keep going through, if you can just back up a little bit. So I know this is made up of, I think, 4 different books.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about what each one of those books is about that comprise everything?
Yeah, that's a great question. So King Jesus Gospel is about what is the gospel.
Okay.
And the main point of that book, and it's a short book, it's an easy read. I would highly recommend everyone read that. If you're going to pick up one Scot McKnight book, pick up the King Jesus Gospel. And that is that salvation is not just about our individual forgiveness of sins and going to heaven when we die, but the gospel is a much bigger message than that. It is God's recreation of everything and our ability to participate in that. It's God's liberation of the oppressed, and it's God's freedom of prisoners and healing of hurting people and sight to the blind. It's what Jesus says in Luke 4 is his mission. I think that's a bigger picture of the gospel. So Scott would say the gospels are the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
The gospel is the story of Jesus. So the gospels are the gospel. It's not just John 3:16. It's all the gospels. It's the story of Israel culminating in the story of Jesus as king, and of the whole world being invited into be part of God's people. So the first part is the King Jesus Gospel. We've got to get the gospel right. The next is the Blue Parakeet, and it's how to read the Bible, which we've just talked a lot about. And then One Life is a discipleship book. It was written for college students, so it's a pretty breezy read. Scott used a really snappy writing style because he knew he was writing to college students. And he used to teach college students at North Park University. So this is really born out of his experience teaching undergrads and their questions about faith. So it's how do we live all of our life oriented toward being disciples of Jesus in our vocation, in our relationships, in the church, in our imagination, in our studies. So it's applicable to more than just students. But I think people would find the tone a little different from his other books. Then the final one is A Fellowship of Difference, and that is about life in the church. And it's difference, differents. Difference, different people coming together to create this fellowship. And that's all about life in the church and how we do unity together. And I can see the evolution of his work. A lot of the stuff he did in Fellowship of Difference starts to look at the themes in Romans that he would later do in reading Romans backwards and really getting into church unity and healing church conflict by appealing to the approach in Romans.
And the importance of the kingdom, the importance of the kingdom of God. The correct emphasis on the kingdom of God, I think, in the book about the gospel. I'm forgetting the name right now, but he had a lot. I think, about that as far as the kingdom, also in that. So, yeah.
If people really want to get more into Scott's work on kingdom, he has a book called The Kingdom Conspiracy. That's all about kingdom of God and draws heavily on Matthew's use of kingdom of heaven to talk about kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm. So what has been the impact? Because I know when I look up your books on Amazon, you got all 5 stars.
Oh, that's great. I haven't even checked lately. That's good to know.
I don't know if it's every single person, but it's all red. I guess it's all yellow. I guess that's how it is in Amazon. What has been the response to your book? I mean, outside of what I see on Amazon, obviously.
Well, it's been fun to see it helping churches of very different types. I've talked to many different denominations and styles of church that are following King Jesus. And that's been fun to see. We did try to make it ecumenical in that sense. It doesn't hold to any particular denominational perspective. And so I'm really glad that it's been useful to a variety of churches. I got my first translated book. This is Following King Jesus in Korean, which was really fun to see. That felt like a big milestone as an author. And it's opened up opportunities for me to write more. This new book that I'm working on, I don't know that it would have been possible without having published these other works, because now I can, I was able to email literary agents and say, hey, I've got these other books down and I'm working on a new one. And they were interested in talking to me. So I'm really, really grateful for those opportunities. Again, Scott has been such a great advocate for women in general, and for me in particular. He is such a good friend and mentor. I love seeing how he is as a dad with his kids and as a husband to his wife. You sometimes see a lot of Christian leaders who don't live out what they teach.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not Scot McKnight. Everything in his books is 100% genuine because I've seen his life up close, and it's true and it's real and it's good. His new book, A Church Called Tov, which is about Tov, goodness, like God's goodness, the goodness in the church, is a good example of that. He wrote it together with his daughter, Laura, and they're just really Tov people. And it's after seeing, kind of one of my hobbies has been researching abuse and spiritual abuse in the church, the sexual abuse crisis in the church. Because as a pastor, I pastor a lot of abuse survivors. So I'm really sensitive to those topics and the need for reform in the church. So I'm really grateful that Scott and Laura are tackling that in their new work. It's really nice to see Tove leaders after seeing so much badness.
No, I definitely appreciate that, and I appreciate you taking time today. As we wrap it up, I do have one last question for you, which we didn't have initially in our, I guess, pre-discussion, but we can see where it goes. Mm-hmm. And that is, I think as an author, as an author, you have definitely opinions about a lot of things. I would imagine, as we all do. What's your thoughts on just the state of the church right now? What would you say some of the main things that the church needs to work on to really get back to? I mean, it is the bride of Christ, but what is it? What do you think it needs to work on most right now?
I think the obsession with power among church leaders is the root of a lot of the problems. Mm-hmm. Pastors should be pastoring people. And Scott wrote another book called Pastor Paul that I got a chance to help him with a little bit, and learned a lot from that about how pastors are shepherds and pastors should be pastoring people. They're not power mongers. They're not authority figures. And when pastors try to hold on to control and they want to control what people consume and watch and believe and think, it gets really dangerous. When white pastors want to hold on to control and so they perpetuate white supremacy, it's a huge evil in the American church right now. When male pastors want to hold on to power and they don't want to give women space to share their gifts, it's a huge problem. When churches, in some cases, actually sexually abuse victims or spiritually abuse victims, or in other cases, victims come to their church asking for help and the church re-traumatizes them by not responding because they want to hold on to their image, and so they have to cover up these great evils. It's a huge problem. So I just see a love of power and control at the root of a lot of this. And I think we have to give that up because the ethics of Jesus are to humble himself, to never take control over. Jesus offers invitations with an open hand, invites us to come, never coerces us into coming. We just need to follow his example. And I think it would radically change church culture.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for your time. I think as we wrap it up, definitely those watching, please check out the book, The Blue Parakeet. And those that have read it, please teach it to others. I think it's a great book and a great way to understand the Bible. So you can definitely, as has been noted, you can check out the Blue Parakeet Instructor Manual, and I'll include information in the show notes. Also consider checking out some of the other books that Scot McKnight has written and that Becky Castle Miller has also included study guides for. And, you know, it's up to us. This is not a program. This is a one person at a time teaching another person, which is really what Jesus did and what discipleship was all about. So let's take the time to really be what God has called us to. Thank you so much for this time. Please consider subscribing to the channel and clicking like. Thanks again.